So my girlfriend and I were both 18 or 19 when she first fell pregnant. And that child died just a few days after we found out, in a miscarriage. Due to our lifestyle, we were both addicts at the time. I've been sober for 5 years now. I don't know what she's up to nowadays. But at the time, we were both drinking heavily, smoking heavily, and using various other substances. So a few months later, she fell pregnant for a second time, and we did a test. I was there when she did the test, and it came back positive, and we did another test, and it came back positive again. So we were pretty sure, and we both had mixed feelings. We were both young and both teenagers, and didn't really know what to do. She was due to continue her studies. I was working, not earning a lot at the time. We talked about abortion as an option. Neither of us really knew how we felt about it at the time, but it was something we were willing to explore because we didn't have a good reason or the language to discuss it between ourselves in any great depth. I think we were both uncomfortable about it, but didn't exactly know why. So we went to the consultation a couple of weeks later, I think. I wasn't allowed in the consultation, even though my girlfriend would have preferred me to go in with her for the emotional support, if nothing else. So I stayed in the waiting room. She went in, hoping to have a discussion and explore an option, and came out maybe 30 minutes later with an abortion booked. And I kind of had whiplash at that point. I was just couldn't believe how fast it was going, and how we had, as a couple, had no opportunity to discuss this at all, how I didn't know anything that had happened in the consultation. And she didn't seem to know what had happened in the consultation either, to be honest. She seemed to be just as surprised and sort of shell-shocked as I was, as we were leaving and as we were making our way home that day. And in the weeks that followed, we both kind of grappled with what we had agreed to somehow, and with whether we should really go through with it, whether it was the right thing. And it was a time of real emotional upheaval, especially for a pair like us who were drinking so heavily at the time, and there was all sorts of, we weren't in our right minds at any time of day really, and as I say, we were both 18 or 19, drinking heavily, and yet we were supposed to make this huge decision, neither of us really comprehending what we were agreeing to or not agreeing to, and what the consequences of our actions would be. When the day of the procedure rolled around, we travelled up to Birmingham to the BPAS clinic. We were both at the end of our tether with stress and confusion by that point, and neither of us sober on the day, self-medicating definitely. To show how stressed we both were, and to make matters worse, we had a car crash on the way. She was driving, and all the cars stopped at a red light, and she was had too much on her mind, wasn't paying attention to the road, and drove straight into the back of somebody's car. So we eventually got to the train station, got the train up to Birmingham, and got to the clinic. Once there, it was a strange environment, to say the least. It was cold, but not in a sort of hospital-esque kind of way. It was cold in a sort of just very uninviting. It's not the kind of place you want to stay, and you walk in and you want to leave. So we're sat down in the waiting room, and eventually she's called for her procedure, I think they called it, and I'm told to wait, stay where I am. So she's taken through. I'm not allowed to accompany her, of course. And at that point, I'm left in the waiting room, sat across from a receptionist who doesn't seem very happy to see me. Is glaring at me through the glass. And I've got a dry mouth, and I'm sweating buckets, and pale, and I'm not looking good. According to my girlfriend anyway, I wasn't looking good. And so she's gone for a while, and I don't know how long she's gone for. It seemed like an eternity. And at some point, a nurse comes along and asks if I'm okay, and brings me a glass of water. And apparently my girlfriend had sent her, as she was preparing for the procedure, she was worried that I wasn't looking too good, and she knew that none of the nurses would give a toss about it, so she sent one to see if I was okay, bring me a glass of water. And aside from that, I just had to wait, and as I say, I don't know how long she was gone for, but seemed like a very long time to be sat there alone, not knowing what's going on, what's happening to my girlfriend or my unborn child. I think that was when I was starting to realise the gravity as I sat there in the clinic, the gravity of what we were doing, and the consequences of what we were doing started to loom in my mind. And I was under the impression that at least she wouldn't be medicated while we were there, because during the consultation we had been told that because of our drug use, she wouldn't be given anything else to risk side effects of the drugs mixing. So I thought at least she isn't going to be in any worse shape chemically than when she went in, and we'll be able to get home safe and whatnot. But when she came back, she told me that mid-procedure they had changed their minds about that, and she had actually been given a pretty hefty dose of codeine, which is an opiate. So when she did eventually come back to me, as we were leaving, she could barely walk. She was, partly because I think the pain and the stress her body was under, and partly the opiates that she had been given on top of whatever else she had taken and drunk that morning. So after the procedure, getting home was difficult. Aside from the gravity of the situation, aside from the emotional upheaval, just physically getting back proved to be a challenge. I was physically holding her up all the way home, and she didn't know whether she was coming or going. She was nodding out on the train. It was just a real mess. When we eventually got home after the abortion, we were both pretty out of it with stress and disillusion, didn't really know what had just happened to us. I tried to make some food because she was in bad shape at that point, physically and mentally, and I thought at least get some food in her and she'll start to pick herself up. And so I tried to cook some dinner, ended up starting a fire in the kitchen because my head just wasn't in what I was doing. And she was given some like continence pads and told to expect that there would be a lot of blood and pieces of the child which hadn't been removed during the procedure but which could come out later on that day, that night, the next day, in a few days' time even. And later that night and the following day she reported having horrible experiences, going to the toilet and seeing pieces of our child, bits and blood and all sorts of horrible stuff coming out of her body, which I can't imagine what that must be like for a young lady to see a piece of one child in a toilet, or her child's blood. Horrific. And in the following days we talked about it and agonized together, tried to keep functioning, going to work. She was doing her studies, I was working, we were trying to keep on top of things. But when we would come back together, we would talk a lot about it, whether we just did the right thing, whether it was a rushed decision, whether what we had done was murder or whether it was something we had a right to do or not. We stayed together for about 1.5 years after the abortion, moved to a different city, tried to press on with life. She went to university, I got a new job. But it was always something that would come up, and though we would sometimes try to ignore it, it was impossible to ignore something like that. So, and impossible to ignore the impact it had on our relationship as well. It was sort of a dark cloud over us from that point. So we just felt confused and alienated, and in our alienation we tried hard to reconnect with one another. And in our desperation we continued having unprotected sex, even after the abortion. I think because we didn't know how to reconnect other than physically. So that's what we did, and maybe a year later she fell pregnant a third time. The child didn't make it, again due to our substance abuse. The child was deformed in the womb. She was actually rushed to hospital at one point because she had passed out when she was at work at her evening job, and she was taken to hospital, and they didn't know what was wrong for a while, but then they discovered that she was pregnant and that the child was deformed. And and it wasn't long after that that we did eventually go our separate ways, just because by this point we were maybe 20 or 21 and still young and still didn't have a clue what had happened or what we had done, and didn't know how to go forward together. So all we could do was go our separate ways, and try and figure it out for ourselves. The loss of that third child was horrific once again. About a year had passed since the abortion, so it was a bit like reopening an old wound. And then there was the difficulty of the sort of moral questions which arose around that. We already had all these moral questions about whether what we had done was the right thing in the first place. And now there was an even more complex situation where the doctors were telling us that this child had to be removed, that it would never be viable, that it was a matter of preserving her life and well-being. So we reopened all those old wounds and brought up all those old questions. And I think that contributed to our mutual retreat at that point into our own ideologies and our own ways of trying to process things. She, on the one hand, went in one direction and got more into her feminism and her feminist way of thinking, started saying things like my body, my choice, and all the slogans, and I went in another direction and started reading more political philosophy, looking at more radical, more extreme ways of governing a society, because I just knew that something had gone very wrong and that it shouldn't have, and that it was unnecessary, and that there must be better ways of doing things. And that's why I was looking for a better way of doing things. And so eventually I became a National Socialist, and I worked for a nationalist organisation, and I was an activist and a political organiser and a writer, and I was doing all this. And so after we broke up, she went down that road, I went down the other road. And we didn't speak more than a handful of times after that. I think because we had just gone in such different directions, and there was no longer any common ground, any meeting in the middle. Which is a shame, because we had been through all that together, and we had done all that together, and if there was anyone who would understand and be able to empathise, then it would have been one another. But in our confusion, we kind of denied ourselves that, and went on these very different paths. Didn't hear from my girlfriend after about 2017. Fast forward a few years, and I was working for a nationalist organisation. I was organising leafleting and involved in protests and publicity stunts and all sorts of political antics. Every weekend I was out doing that sort of thing. I was writing, covering current affairs from a nationalist perspective. And I'd found an ideology which gave me a way to rage against the system which I felt had let me down and let my girlfriend down and let my children down. And so I spent a good few years just happily raging. But at a certain point, I saw the futility of what I was doing. The actual point when it occurred was when on one occasion at an event I had organised, a load of anti-fascists turned up and mobbed me as I was getting ready to host an event in Sevenoaks in the southeast of England. And they come across the car park and it all kicks off, and it's 30 or 40 against 1, so I don't stand a chance. And as I'm on the floor being kicked and punched, I just realised all these lads are young English men. They're the kind of men that I relate to and that I wanted to help. That's why I got into politics in the first place, because those are the kind of youngsters that I thought were being let down. And now we're just scrapping on a street like a bunch of savages, and it seemed completely absurd to me. And that was the last political event I organised. I wrote maybe 1 or 2 articles after that point, and a few months later I officially resigned my position with the organisation I had worked for and ceased all political activity. At which point I couldn't avoid the guilt or the grief anymore, which I had been avoiding for many years by that point. And so I just broke down and I had to quit my job. I could barely leave my flat. I was just a complete wreck. Panic attacks, depression, constant anxiety, and didn't know what to do with any of it or how to cope with any of it anymore. Possibly because I didn't have anyone else to blame anymore, or any narrative to spin about it anymore. And it was at that point that my father suggested I start praying. So that's what I did. He taught me a prayer, the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy upon me, a sinner. I thought that's a simple enough prayer, and even if I can't leave my flat or work or function, I can just sit and say those words and ask God to help me and see what happens. And so that was what started me off on the road to becoming a Christian, which I'd never been before. I'd been nominally Anglican as a boy. I was never baptized, but I was dragged to church every week until I was about 8 or 9. So I became a Christian for the first time, and the following Easter I joined the Catholic Church. And by that point I was able to work and function again, because I had, through prayer and through getting hold of a second-hand Bible which my friend gave me, I was able to start reading the Gospel and discover a language and a way of thinking about these things which isn't just confusion and isn't just my body, my choice, or this amoral confusion. It was a way to talk about whether things are right or wrong, or true or false, or good or evil. And I was able to find some peace in that, some stability in that. Even now knowing that what we had done was wrong, was gravely wrong. At least I knew and could start to deal with that fact within myself. I started wondering what to do with myself now that I was a Christian, now that I was a Catholic, now that I was looking at everything very differently from how I had for the whole rest of my life. I went to a Franciscan priest, Father Columba, from the Franciscan Friars of the Renewal, for advice, and found him very helpful, and he helped me with my discernment of what should I do now. And as part of that discernment, he gave me a list of tasks he wanted me to accomplish, things he wanted me to do that would be conducive to that end. And on that list of things was he wanted me to attend a Rachel's Vineyard retreat. So I sent off some emails and ended up speaking to somebody from Rachel's Vineyard. And in January or February of 2023, I attended a long weekend retreat with Rachel's Vineyard in the Midlands. It was difficult, to say the least. It's very strange when you spend years not talking about something because it's so taboo to talk about it, especially for a man, to voice any kind of view on it, or even to ask questions about it. It's weird to go from that to suddenly being in an environment for a whole weekend where you have to do a lot of talking and confront these things and process things that you've never processed in all them years since the abortion, and also just to be around people who are on that same journey and can empathise and relate, and who are maybe a little further along that journey and already have ways of speaking about these things and have built up a certain openness, which starts to rub off on you being around them. So it was difficult, but very worthwhile, and I was very glad to be there with a real mix of men and women. It's about a 50-50 split between men and women, all with their own stories, all equally heartbreaking stories. People of all ages. We had people in their 20s like myself, people in middle age, people who had finished working and were retired. And that was one of the takeaways of the retreat, was that this stuff affects people of every walk of life, men and women, people of all ages and races, and people of different lines of work and economic standing. They were all there together, speaking about this common experience of grief and guilt and sorrow, and all on a mutual journey of healing on the other hand. After the retreat, I was, well, for the first few days I was just exhausted. I think I slept for about 2 days after that retreat. And then maybe a month or so later we had a reunion, which again was very healing, because I think after a retreat like that, where you've confronted such difficult emotional topics and covered such extreme emotional and spiritual ground together, everyone's just knackered. And so it's good to come back together with a clear head and be able to talk about things and where everyone's up to. The reason I wanted to share my experience and talk about this publicly is because I didn't for a long time, and that guilt and grief and everything I was feeling, I'm sure everything my girlfriend was feeling, just festered and ate away at us for years. And I know that there are many, many others out there, as I speak now, who are at various points in that same journey, either dealing with those initial moral questions, should we, shouldn't we, or they have had an abortion and they don't know where to go from there. They feel all this guilt, but they don't know how to talk about it. They don't know if there's any way back from what they've done. They don't know where to turn for consolation or for mercy. Now it makes me think about my kids who physically didn't have a voice. And then there are all these hordes of other people who don't have a voice because physically they have a voice, but their voice has been silenced by various societal pressures in the culture around these questions. And the way we talk about these things, or the way we don't talk about these things. And especially men who are often told that they have no place in these conversations, that it's a woman's body, so it's all up to her, and what would a man know about it anyway? But it's an important conversation for the whole culture to have, and it's important to that end that men who do have something to say about these things say it, and that we don't bottle these things up, even if it's a bit of a risk, even if you have to risk being cancelled or being told you have no place in the conversation. And for women too, even if you have to risk being called all sorts of names and told you're not supporting other women and their rights and all the rest of it. It's a matter of life and death, so it's worth taking those risks. I think we have a duty to stand up and say something about it, even though it's difficult, and it is difficult.